Thank you very much for your attention. I have written some notes which I'll read with your permission. My name is Chin Lin Soo, but my friends and associates, and I see some of them here today, have formed the habit of referring to me as Willie. This does not displease me at all. I've been asked today to speak briefly about a great enterprise, which I had the honor to be connected with as a humble worker and later as a general contractor for labor. I speak of a mighty project of Herculean dimension, the Central Pacific Railroad, the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Being pressed for an account of my impressions and for an anecdote or two, I would like to first dispel an erroneous report that has now become accepted fact. I speak of the description of Chinese men hanging from wicker baskets high above the valley floor, and who in various colorful accounts with apparent industry are putting at risk both life and limb in order to insert black blasting powder into hand-chiseled holes, lighting the fuse, and then depending on those hardy partners above who are securing the ropes from which they dangle like so many Chinese lanterns from a granite tree to pull them to safety. This image is close to the truth, but suffers from having been retold so many times that the true facts have been lost. It does not require a great deal of thought nor strain the imagination to believe that reporters in newspapers and touring guidebooks may have attempted to provide more. Thank you very much. Did we work together? I have something I know you. Oh, very good. If you're ever in Colorado, please come visit me. Where was I? Yes, I'm sorry. Touring guidebooks have attempted to provide a more sensational entertainment for the credulous and have embellished the facts. The cliff face was a craggy challenge that faced the hard-working Chinese laborers at that point of progress. It is popularly referred to as Cape Horn, in tribute to its imagined similarity to that nemesis of the sailor who wishes to travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back again at the southernmost point of Land's End. Indeed, the prominence caused no small amount of trepidation when engineers first viewed the mighty foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, mistakenly thinking that the material that composed the mountain was pure granite. Some of those, being possessed of a nervous nature, predicted a lengthy, costly, and slow progress around the summit in order to continue. But upon closer investigation, it became apparent that this was not the case, that rock was much softer and easier to work than had been previously thought. In fact, the work on this section of the railroad finished ahead of time with considerably less loss in material and, more importantly, life. While indeed that incline of the section of cliff is steep, it does not approach the perpendicular. The incline is 50% in most places, which requires men wear a rope secured around their waist while the other end is held by a worker on top, simply because in the concentration of work taking place, a man might slip or misplace his foot, and the rope is there to prevent him from sliding and tumbling down to a gruesome end at the valley floor. But, and I must emphatically make this point, nowhere is the cliff face such a sheer drop that it would require men to swing from waist-high baskets as reckless but factually incorrect written accounts that you may have read and have come under your inspection. That having been said, I wish to give some impressions of how I came to be associated with the project and the general work of the rail line. As a young man of 22 years of age, I arrived here in San Francisco in the year 1859. Much has been made of the fact that I speak English very well and am quite tall for a member of my race. The rumors propose that I am of other than celestial birth and heritage. well, these are unfounded. As far as I know, my forebears were the sons of the Empire of Japan, of China. So far back in history, the Western calendar fails to record those thousands of years before the building of time that marks the beginning of the accounts of the West. Forced by wars in China, as terrible as the conflict that now here recently took place between the northern and southern states, and by cruel disasters by nature's hand that afflicted my land of birth like so many biblical plagues of old, I chose to leave my wife in security at home and try to seek my fortune in the gold mountain, as we call California. I arrived too late to take part in that grand adventure of 1849, but fate had a different plan for my future. In my first early years, I pursued whatever opportunity that presented itself to me, and very early I learned that a man who can speak two languages is worth two men. Unlike most of my countrymen who plan to return home in time, I gave serious thought to adopting this crude but bountiful nation as my own. By two simple devices, I learned to speak the language of the Americans in a short period of time. One, I knew that without exception, no American was ever going to make an effort to learn our language, no matter how inconvenient it was to do without. So I took to heart that adage that says, fate favors those who are prepared, and applied myself in moments of leisure, not to gambling, as so many others do, but to study. And second, it is a fact that Americans believe that members of other nations with no previous experience with English will be able to understand what is being said to them if the Americans speak very, very slowly. You bring 5 China boy here tomorrow, sabe? Yes, boss, 5 Chinamen here tomorrow. Me sabe. By listening carefully, repeating what I heard, and questioning every other Chinese that I met who had some skill in speaking with Americans, I gained ability in English conversation quite rapidly. Next, it was my observation that in most cases success comes to those willing to take a risk, accepting responsibility, and fulfilling the request on time always leads to more opportunities. With these simple tools, I was able to quickly place myself in a position of advantage over time. In 1862, California stood alone on the western shores of this mighty continent, and travel and commerce were hampered by the time it took to complete a transaction and a shipment of goods from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. The idea of a great railroad, yes, a great railroad that would cross the vast plains, the mighty mountains, that would join the railroads of the East with the emerging railroads of the West. This was conceived of, and plans were laid. The Central Pacific Railroad began in 1863, but suffered from several impediments. First and foremost, a lack of suitable laborers. California at this time had only been a state in the Union for a scant 13 years. The great migration of fortune seekers in 1849 to California notwithstanding, the applicants for the project numbered in the mere hundreds of souls. Even a modest speculation would put the number of required laborers in the many, many thousands. While the cruel war between the states was raging in the East, real progress on the railroad was unrealized. At the completion of the conflict which had divided the Union, peace once again reigned, and a serious attempt was started to go forward on the rail line. At this point, Mr. Charles Crocker and Mr. Stolbride conceived of an astonishing plan. They would use the sons of the Celestial Empire of China. Trial gangs of men were called, tested, and when they proved to be more than satisfactory, a general call went out for thousands. The sons of the Yellow Emperor came to Sacramento and joined the great enterprise. It was in the early part of its formation that I became involved in the position of labor contractor. The Central Pacific Chinese workers worked for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for about $26 a month, and had to provide their own food in tents. Most of the Chinese men hoped to save enough money to buy land upon their return to China. American workers were paid $35 a month, and were furnished with food and shelter. The work allotted to the China boys was grueling and performed almost entirely by hand, with pickaxes, hammers, crowbars. Workers chipped out rail beds, moved dirt and rock with baskets and carts. Tree stumps were rooted out, track laid, spikes driven, aqueducts and tunnels constructed. In the bitter winter of 1865 to 1866, when the railroad carved passages to the summit of the Sierra Nevadas, 3,000 China boys lived and worked in tunnels dug beneath the 40-foot deep snowdrifts. During this great enterprise, accidents, avalanches, explosion took the lives of over 1,200 Chinese men. Some of the bodies were swept away by the terrible river of collapsing snow to their demise. Often, we were unable to reclaim their remains until the following spring, when the ice had melted. In some cases, the bodies were swept to the valley floor of that rugged land and never found. There were harsh winters, frozen rivers, massive prominences that faced the sturdy China boys, but with firm determination and will, tunneling under snowdrifts when needed, the Chinese became men who conquered mountains. Yes, lives were lost in the process, but those who survived never flinched in their duty, living on salted fish, dried oysters, desiccated vegetables, tea, and the oriental staff of life, rice. They made their way over, under, and around any barrier that they encountered. At this juncture, I would like to point out the magnificent work of 848 Chinese men who, working at an average speed of 1 mile track a day, 1 mile track an hour, were able to lay down 10 miles of track in one day. The date was April 29th, 1869. The place? Promontory Point, Utah. Towards the completion of the colossal project, crews of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific drew closer day by day to a meeting of the two railroad lines. The Union Pacific boasted that it had laid 6 miles of track in one day. Central Pacific answered with 7. The Union Pacific responded with 7.5 miles. You see, a robust rivalry had risen between the men of the two crews. Charles Crocker claimed that Central Pacific could and would lay 10 miles of track in one day. Wagers were made, plans were formulated. The task would require, according to the accounts kept at the time, 25,800 railroad ties, 3,520 rails, 243 pounds apiece, 55,000 spikes, and 14,000 bolts. In the end, the Chinese crew of the Central Pacific Railroad laid 10 miles and added an extra 1,800 feet for good measure, an effort and an accomplishment which has never been equaled even to this day. On May 10th, 1869, at the moment of the driving of the last spike into the last rail laid, a telegraph message was tapped out to the waiting receivers across the distance of the United States. At the joining of the iron of the East with the gold of the West, at the completion of a project that reduced the time and danger of travel from the East Coast to the ocean of the Pacific from 166 days to 11 days in comfort and inconvenience, a project that bound the nation east and west in much the same as the recent conflict between the northern and southern states ended in a hard-won victory that secured the nation now and forever at the last link, providing an overland route for the goods of the Pacific, of distant India, China, and Japan to the waiting cities of Boston, New York, and Washington. A single word was sent over miles of copper wire by Morse code, a single word that electrified the nation. That word was done. Thank you.